In the 5 years since Pope Francis assumed his position in the Vatican, his efforts at reformation have left conservative Catholics and liberals at odds on how they view his leadership of the Church. Earlier, I spoke with Ross Douthat. He's a New York Times op-ed columnist and author of the new book, To Change the Church. It's published by Simon & Schuster, a division of CBS. Douthat is known for his sometimes critical analysis of the Pope's leadership. He says some of the Pope's changes to the Church may be unwise. Here's that conversation. Ross, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So let me start off with something that you wrote at the beginning of the book. In the preface of your book, you write about the moment that we are living in right now, and you say this, quote, "This is a hinge moment in the history of Catholicism, a period of theological crisis that's larger than just the Francis pontificate, but whose particular peak under this Pope will be remembered, studied, and argued over for as long as the Catholic Church endures." What did you set out to do with this book?
I was trying to tell, first and foremost, a really interesting story. The book is critical of Pope Francis in certain ways. I'm writing as a conservative Catholic who thinks that it's possible that some of the changes Francis is trying to make to the Church are unwise. But I'm also writing as a journalist and someone who writes in my day job for a secular audience. And I think if the book succeeds, and I hope it does, it illuminates what is really a sort of fascinating moment in the history of Catholicism, where you have a Pope pushing for changes, you have cardinals and bishops and theologians arguing about it and fighting about it and even criticizing the Pope himself in ways that I think is sort of familiar from the Church of, say, the 13th century or the Middle Ages, but isn't something that we necessarily associate with modern Catholicism. So the story is sort of the primary purpose, and the argument is in there too.
And you describe Pope Francis as, quote, "the globe-trotting do-gooder CEO of Catholicism, Inc." Can you explain that, and what is your own assessment of that particular leadership posture?
Well, that's the interesting thing is that the papacy, as it's become less powerful politically, right, as the popes have lost kingdoms and principalities and all the rest, it's become much more of this kind of celebrity figure, where the Pope is the kind of, Steve Jobs of Catholicism. He's with a little bit of Gandhi and the Rolling Stones worked in. And I think the most successful thing that Francis has done is sort of lean into that role and say, look, if you're going to be treated as this kind of celebrity figure, you should make the most of it. And he's obviously been more effective than his predecessor, Pope Benedict, at sort of crafting really imagery, I think, for our television and internet age. The images of him washing the feet of prisoners and embracing disfigured people, they're like an iconography, basically, a kind of Christian iconography that goes viral and I think has sort of effectively reminded people, even in our very secular and sometimes jaded profession, that, the Christian story is still one that has the capacity to, really capture people's imaginations.
Without getting too in the weeds of theology here, you, though, have some very serious reservations about what you perceive as Francis perhaps opening the door to straying from doctrine. Can you just give us a sense of that? What is it that you are most disturbed by?
I mean, I think Francis sees himself, I think pretty consciously at this point, as seeking a kind of truce with the world after the sexual revolution, right? The world that all of us live in, the world of divorce and same-sex marriage and so on. And he sees that as sort of a prerequisite for the Church being able to evangelize, to reach people anew. And there are ways in which I think that's plausible, but the specific issues that he's picked, and particularly his attempt to, in effect, sort of completely end the Church's rules about receiving communion if you've been divorced and remarried, I think push the Church's claim to say that marriages are actually for life, are actually indissoluble. They push it to a kind of breaking point. And I mean, I'm, a layman and a journalist, but this is something that a lot of, again, theologians and cardinals and more serious people think. And to me, this sort of presents as a conservative argument, but ultimately, I think it's about defending the sort of weird radicalism of the New Testament, where, Jesus says a lot of strange things about marriage. Marriage is indissoluble, it's for life. You have to eat my flesh and drink my blood if you want to have life with me. Lots of crazy stuff. And one of the virtues of Catholicism in all its corruption and weirdness over the years is that it has really tried to preserve that radicalism. And I think there's a danger in essentially saying the world has changed so much that we need to leave, not only traditional doctrine and dogma, but the real radicalism of the New Testament behind.
You also draw some parallels between this Pope and President Trump. You write this.
People always ask about that.
You write this. Imagine on a show like Red and Blue asking you about that. But you write of this Pope, quote, his highly personalized style, his willingness to make a mess in the service of internal revolution, in all this and more, he resembles many of the Western populists who have risen toward power, or in the case of Trump, attained it. What do you mean by that?
I mean that Francis is, like Trump, an outsider figure who's sort of taken the reins of an institution that has lost the faith of a lot of its constituents, that's been beset by scandal and is seen in decline and all of these things. And in that sense, they're both sort of representative figures for an age of lost confidence in institutions, an age when people are looking to sort of charismatic change agents and so on. Now, none of this means that they're similar figures in their personal morality or in their agendas. Obviously, we're talking about Red and Blue, and on most hot-button political issues, immigration and so on, Trump is red and Francis, sort of surprisingly to some people, is blue. So they're different figures. They're different personally, they're different politically, but institutionally, they actually have a lot in common. Where
does this leave Catholics who are in the middle and have always sort of sensed that maybe they were somewhere in between?
I mean, I think at his best, Francis wants to be a pope for that kind of Catholic. He wants to criticize conservatives in one moment and liberals in another, traditionalists and then radicals. I think the challenge of the Francis pontificate is that as time has gone by and conservatives, I guess including people like me, have become more critical of him, he's become more critical of us, in a sense. And in that sense, I think Catholics in the middle sort of have an obligation to sort of treat him with the honor and respect that the Pope is due, but also recognize that there's a real debate going on here. And it's actually, it's not necessarily important to your everyday life of belief and prayer, but if you take sort of the Church as a public institution seriously, you need to pay attention to it. And you may not agree with the arguments that, for instance, I make, but you should be at least familiar with them. But of course, every book author thinks that, right? So.
Let me ask you, in your view, how is the Church faring in sort of the never-ending struggle between retaining its own values and modernity under this particular Pope? Where do you see the Church?
I mean, I think there's a challenge there that his predecessors didn't solve, but neither has he. And there's something we like to talk about, a Francis effect, right, in the media, and what I was talking about earlier, the sort of fascination with his gestures and images and so on. And that's real, but so far it's only real as a media phenomenon. If you look at mass attendance under Francis, if you look at vocations to the priesthood, all of these indicators, they've either remained stagnant or the latest numbers from Gallup in the U.S. show a pretty clear decline. So the
can I
challenge...
stop you there for one moment, though?
Yeah.
Because what about people who might say the change that may be occurring may not be measurable? If a change is occurring in someone's heart, you won't necessarily see that in the pews.
But if it isn't measurable, then the institution is in trouble, right? And you're into sort of territory of a different kind of, there is a form of Christianity that says all that matters is what's in your heart and not whether you attend Mass. But that's not the Catholic position, or it hasn't been traditionally. And a Catholicism that, a pontificate, a pope who has admirers who admire him personally but don't feel an attachment to his church, who drift away from it, is not an institutional success in the long run. He's not a success as Pope, no matter how much of a success he might be as a kind of general inspirational figure.
You call Francis's reforms part of a, quote, ambiguous revolution, and say that he's making reforms without any sort of specific major reformation planned. I mean, tell me about why you think that is.
Well, I think he has a plan, but I think he, like all popes, is constrained by the fact that the Pope has this absolute power over the Church, and yet he's not supposed to change anything. The whole point of the job is to hand on the teaching untouched and so on. So for someone who has ambitions to make changes, in particular for Francis, these changes around sort of, the hot button issues of the day, you have to do so ambiguously. You have to do so with a kind of, the big change on divorce and remarriage exists in a footnote of this huge papal document. And I think that's conscious. There's a strategy at the Vatican that says, look, we can't explicitly say we're changing things because that would, turn this into a much bigger crisis, but we can sort of give permission slips and sort of offer winks and nods and so on and get to the same place ambiguously and avoid some sort of explicit schism or breakage.
As a conservative, is there anything that sort of heartens you under this papacy?
I mean, I think the thing that we started out talking about, right? The fact that even in this supposedly secular and disenchanted age, people can be so fascinated with and taken by a religious figure, a Christian figure. That's heartening to me. And, I mean, obviously I think this or I wouldn't have written a book, but the fact that these issues are taken seriously, that we can have a live debate 2,000 years later about what Jesus actually meant about marriage and what the church that claims to have been founded about him should do today. There's no reason for Christian pessimism in that. Just the fact that you're willing to have me here having this conversation, as unconvincing as I might be, is itself, I think, a reason to think that there is life in Catholic Christianity yet.
Well, you are always welcome here. Ross Douthat, thank you so much.
Thank you.